Welcome back. Today we are exploring the Indian Constitution and its preamble. Let us dive straight into the lesson to understand these core principles. The journey of the Indian Constitution begins with the Constituent Assembly. Formed in November 1946, this body was created under the scheme formulated by the Cabinet Mission Plan. Initially, it had 389 members, representing various provinces and princely states, but after partition, the strength was reduced to 299. When they first met on 9th December 1946, Dr. Sachidananda Sinha was appointed as the temporary president, following the French practice of electing the oldest member. Just 2 days later, Dr. Rajendra Prasad was elected as the permanent president of the assembly with H.C. Mukherjee as vice president. This dedicated group of visionaries worked tirelessly, taking exactly 2 years, 11 months, and 18 days to draft the longest written constitution in the world. You must remember these foundational facts, as the UPSC frequently tests the structural timeline of the assembly. Every single day of those nearly 3 years was spent debating the future of a newly independent nation. Let's map out the critical timeline of the Constituent Assembly. It all started on 9th December 1946 with the very first meeting of the Assembly in New Delhi. Shortly after, on 13th December, Jawaharlal Nehru moved the historic Objective Resolution, which laid down the philosophical foundations of the Constitution. Why is this resolution so important? It eventually became the preamble we know today. Fast forward to 26th November 1949. This is the day the Constitution was officially adopted and enacted by the Assembly. Some provisions came into force immediately. Finally, on 26th January 1950, the Constitution came into full effect, marking the birth of the Republic of India. This specific date was chosen to honor the Purna Swaraj Declaration of 1930. Memorize this sequence because chronological arrangement questions are a staple in the preliminary examination. Before we dive into the text itself, take a moment to appreciate the physical document. The original Constitution of India was not typed or printed. It was entirely handwritten by Prem Behari Narain Raizada in a flowing italic style. The beautiful calligraphy was complemented by intricate artwork on every single page. Artists from Shantiniketan, including Nandlal Bose and Bioha Ramanohar Sinha, illuminated the manuscript with scenes from Indian history, mythology, and nature. This wasn't just a legal document, it was a masterpiece of Indian art and heritage. The original copies, written in both Hindi and English, are preserved in special helium-filled cases in the Library of the Parliament of India to prevent decay. When you study the Constitution, remember that it was crafted with immense care, reflecting the soul of a civilization stepping into a modern democratic era. This artistic heritage is a proud symbol of our republic. To manage the massive task of drafting, the Assembly appointed several committees. The most crucial was the Drafting Committee, chaired by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. Set up on 29 August 1947, it was responsible for preparing the final draft of the Constitution. Jawaharlal Nehru chaired the Union Powers Committee, which dealt with the distribution of power at the federal level. Meanwhile, the Provincial Constitution Committee was led by the Iron Man of India, Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, ensuring the integration of states. Patel also headed the highly important Advisory Committee on Fundamental Rights, Minorities and Tribal Areas, which shaped the core rights of citizens. Finally, the Steering Committee, which guided the overall functioning of the Assembly, was chaired by Dr. Rajendra Prasad. For the UPSC exam, matching these committees with their respective chairpersons is a very common question format, so keep this list handy. Let's test your recall on the historical background with a quick question. Who moved the historic objective resolution in the Constituent Assembly on 13th December 1946? Option A. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. Option B. Jawaharlal Nehru. Option C. Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel. Or option D. Dr. Rajendra Prasad. Take a few seconds to think about the timeline we just discussed. The correct answer is B. Jawaharlal Nehru. He introduced this resolution to lay down the underlying principles of the Constitution. It declared India as an independent sovereign republic and guaranteed justice, equality, and freedom to all its citizens. This very resolution, after being unanimously adopted by the Assembly in January 1947, eventually took the form of the preamble. If you chose A, remember that Dr. Ambedkar was the head of the drafting committee, not the author of the objective resolution. Now we move to the soul of the document. Let's write out exactly what the preamble is. By definition, the preamble is the introduction or preface to the Constitution. Think of it as the identity card of the Constitution, a term famously coined by N.A.A. Paul Kaivala. Its origin is deeply rooted in history. It is based directly on the objective resolution drafted and moved by Pandit Nehru and adopted by the Constituent Assembly. It wasn't copied blindly. It was a homegrown declaration of intent. Finally, its purpose. The preamble contains the summary or essence of the entire Constitution. It tells us the source of the Constitution's authority, the nature of the Indian state, and the objectives it seeks to achieve for its citizens. While it does not grant specific powers, it acts as a guiding light for interpreting the complex articles that follow. Let's break down the actual text of the preamble into four distinct components. First, it reveals the source of authority with the opening words, "We, the people of India." This signifies that the Constitution derives its power directly from the citizens, not from any external authority. Second, it defines the nature of the Indian state. It declares India to be a sovereign, socialist, secular, democratic, and republican polity. These 5 words are the pillars of our political system. Third, it outlines the core objectives of the Constitution. It aims to secure justice, liberty, equality, and fraternity for all its citizens. These are the goals the state must strive to achieve. Lastly, it states the date of adoption. It explicitly mentions 26th November 1949 as the day the people adopted, enacted, and gave themselves this Constitution. Every single word here carries immense constitutional weight. Let's analyze the first 3 words that define the nature of the Indian state. First is sovereign. This means India is an independent nation. It is neither a dependency nor a dominion of any other nation. We are free to conduct our own internal and external affairs. Next is socialist. This means a commitment to democratic socialism, aiming to end poverty, ignorance, and inequality of opportunity through peaceful means. Notice the third column. This word was not in the original text. It was added by the 42nd Amendment Act in 1976. The third term is secular. This means the state has no official religion. All religions in the country have the same status and support from the state. Like socialist, this term was also explicitly added by the 42nd Amendment in 1976. These additions reflect the evolving nature of our constitutional philosophy. Continuing with the nature of the state, we have 2 more crucial terms. The word democratic implies that the Constitution rests on the principle of popular sovereignty. The people hold the supreme power. In India, we practice representative parliamentary democracy, where the executive is responsible to the legislature. This ensures that the government is always accountable to the citizens who elected it. Finally, we have republic. A democratic polity can be a monarchy, like Britain, or a republic, like the USA. India is a republic, which means the head of the state, the president, is always elected directly or indirectly for a fixed period. It also means that political sovereignty vests in the people, not in a single individual like a king, and all public offices are open to every citizen without any discrimination. These two concepts ensure that power remains with the public. Beyond defining the state, the preamble sets out four grand objectives for its citizens: justice, liberty, equality, and fraternity. Justice in our constitution is not just legal, it is social, economic, and political. It aims to eliminate inequalities in wealth and status. Liberty is not absolute freedom to do anything, but the freedom of thought, expression, belief, faith, and worship, subject to constitutional limits. Equality ensures the absence of special privileges for any section of society, providing adequate opportunities for all individuals without discrimination. And finally, fraternity. Fraternity means a sense of brotherhood. The Constitution promotes this feeling of brotherhood through the system of single citizenship. It assures two things: the dignity of the individual and the unity and integrity of the nation. These four ideals form the moral compass of the Indian Constitution, guiding lawmakers and the judiciary in their pursuit of a fair society. A major constitutional debate was whether the preamble is actually a part of the Constitution. In the Barubari Union case of 1960, the Supreme Court initially ruled that the preamble is not a part of the Constitution, stating it was merely a key to the minds of the makers. However, this was famously overturned in the landmark Kesavananda Bharati case of 1973. Here, the Supreme Court held that the preamble is a part of the Constitution, recognizing its extreme importance in interpreting the text. This stance was reaffirmed in the 1995 Lai C of India case, where the court stated the preamble is an integral part of the Constitution. But you must remember one critical caveat for your exam. Despite being a part of the Constitution, the preamble is non-justiciable. This means its provisions cannot be directly enforced in a court of law. Let's check your understanding of the preamble's amendments. By which constitutional amendment act were the words socialist, secular, and integrity added to the preamble? Option A, the 42nd Amendment Act of 1976. Option B, the 44th Amendment Act of 1978. Option C, the First Amendment Act of 1951. Or option D, the 73rd Amendment Act of 1992. Take a moment to recall the timeline. The correct answer is A, the 42nd Amendment Act of 1976. This is often called the mini-constitution because of the vast changes it brought. The preamble has been amended only once in history, during the emergency, to include these three specific words. The Supreme Court in the Kesavananda Bharati case ruled that the preamble can be amended under Article 368, provided the basic structure of the Constitution is not destroyed. Before we wrap up this section, let's lock in some high-yield facts with a quick recall exercise. First question. The Constituent Assembly took exactly how long to draft the Constitution? Think about the timeline. It took 2 years, 11 months, and 18 days. Next question. Who was the chairman of the crucial drafting committee? You should know this one instantly. It was Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, the chief architect of our Constitution. Final question for this round. The preamble is directly based on which historic resolution moved by Jawaharlal Nehru? It is based on the Objective Resolution. Mastering these foundational facts is absolutely essential because they form the bedrock of your polity preparation. In our next segment, we will dive deeper into the specific articles, starting with the Union and its territories. Moving into the core of the Constitution, we arrive at Part 3, which houses the fundamental rights. These are covered from Article 12 to Article 35. This section is famously described as the Magna Carta of India, drawing a parallel to the historic English Charter of Rights. Why are they so crucial? Because they are justiciable in nature. This means if your rights are violated, you can directly approach the courts for enforcement. However, you must remember a critical point for your exam. Fundamental rights are not absolute. They are qualified, meaning the state can impose reasonable restrictions on them to balance individual liberty with social control. Finally, these rights are not permanent in all situations. They can be suspended during the operation of a national emergency, except for the rights guaranteed by Articles 20 and 21. Understanding this balance between individual freedom and state authority is essential for analyzing any constitutional issue. Before we look at specific rights, we need to understand who these rights protect you against. Article 12 defines the term the state for the purposes of Part 3. This definition is incredibly broad. It includes the Government and Parliament of India, state legislatures, local authorities like municipalities, and even statutory bodies like LIC or ONGC. If any of these entities violate your rights, you can sue them. Next, we have a cornerstone of our democracy. Article 13 declares that any law that is inconsistent with or derogates from the fundamental rights shall be void. This is a massive power. What constitutional principle does this establish? It establishes the doctrine of judicial review. It empowers the Supreme Court and High Courts to declare a law unconstitutional if it infringes on Part 3. This acts as a powerful shield, ensuring the legislature cannot arbitrarily strip away the liberties granted to the citizens. Let's break down the first major category of fundamental rights. The right to equality is covered from Articles 14 to 18. It is not just one single concept, but a cluster of protections. Article 14 lays the general foundation, guaranteeing equality before the law and equal protection of laws. Article 15 gets more specific, prohibiting discrimination by the state on grounds only of religion, race, caste, sex, or place of birth. Article 16 extends this principle of non-discrimination specifically to matters of public employment, ensuring equal opportunity for all citizens in government jobs. Then, the Constitution tackles specific historical injustices. Article 17 abolishes the practice of untouchability in any form, making it a punishable offense. Finally, Article 18 abolishes state-conferred titles like Maharaja or Raj Bahadur to prevent the creation of an artificial nobility. Together, these 5 articles dismantle systemic inequality and aim to establish a truly egalitarian society. Article 14 contains 2 distinct expressions that you must differentiate for the UPSC exam. First, let's look at their origins. Equality before the law is a British concept, while equal protection of laws is borrowed from the American Constitution. Their nature is fundamentally different. The British concept is negative, implying the absence of any special privilege for anyone. The American concept is positive, requiring the state to take affirmative action. What do they actually mean? The first means no man is above the law, whether he is a rich businessman or a poor laborer. The second means that people in similar circumstances should be treated similarly by the law. This leads to their application. The negative concept treats everyone exactly the same, which can sometimes be unfair. The positive concept recognizes that likes should be treated alike. It allows the state to classify people logically, taxing the rich more heavily than the poor, for example, to achieve true equity. Moving deeper into equality, Article 15 is a powerful tool against social prejudice. It explicitly forbids the state from discriminating against any citizen on grounds of religion, race, caste, sex, or place of birth. Pay close attention to the phrasing here. The use of the word only is crucial. It means discrimination based on these grounds combined with something else, like educational qualification, is perfectly valid. Furthermore, the Constitution is pragmatic. It explicitly allows the state to make special provisions for women, children, and socially and educationally backward classes. This is the constitutional basis for affirmative action. Article 16 applies this same logic to public employment, guaranteeing equal opportunity for all citizens applying for government jobs. However, just like Article 15, it has exceptions. It permits the state to implement reservations in appointments for any backward class of citizens that is not adequately represented in state services. This is the foundation of the famous Mandel Commission recommendations. The final two articles under the right to equality address deep-rooted historical issues in Indian society. Article 17 boldly abolishes untouchability and forbids its practice in any form whatsoever. This is a unique provision. Unlike most other fundamental rights, Article 17 is absolute. There are absolutely no exceptions, and no reasonable restrictions can be applied to justify untouchability. To give this teeth, Parliament enacted the Protection of Civil Rights Act in 1955, which prescribed severe punishments for this offense. Next, we look at social hierarchy created by the state. Article 18 abolishes titles. The British government used to confer titles like Rai Bahadur or Sir to create a loyal aristocratic class. The Constitution bans this to ensure a society of equal citizens. However, it makes a logical exception. Military and academic distinctions, such as the Param Vir Chakra or a PhD, are exempted because they recognize merit and service rather than birthright. Let's test your understanding of the right to equality, as this is a high-yield area for the preliminary exam. Here is your question. Which article allows the state to make special provisions for the advancement of any socially and educationally backward classes? Option A is Article 14. Option B is Article 15. Option C is Article 17. And option D is Article 18. Take a few seconds to recall the specific exceptions we just discussed. The correct answer is B, Article 15. While Article 14 establishes the general rule of equality before the law, Article 15 specifically deals with non-discrimination. Crucially, it explicitly contains the exception clause allowing affirmative action and special provisions for backward classes, women, and children, making it the correct choice. We now transition to the right to freedom, starting with the most frequently debated provision in the Constitution. Article 19 originally guaranteed 7 freedoms, but the right to property was removed. Today, it guarantees 6 fundamental freedoms to all citizens. First is the freedom of speech and expression, which includes the freedom of the press. Second is the right to assemble peacefully and without arms. Third is the right to form associations, unions, or cooperative societies. Fourth is the right to move freely throughout the territory of India. Fifth is the right to reside and settle in any part of the country. And finally, the sixth freedom is the right to practice any profession or to carry on any occupation, trade, or business. These 6 freedoms form the absolute bedrock of a vibrant, functioning democracy, allowing citizens to participate fully in civic life and build their livelihoods. While the 6 freedoms are expansive, they cannot be limitless. If everyone did exactly as they pleased, society would collapse into anarchy. Therefore, the freedoms guaranteed under Article 19 are not absolute. The Constitution itself authorizes the state to impose reasonable restrictions on these rights through clauses 19(2) to 19(6). The word reasonable is key here. The courts decide if a restriction is justified. What are the grounds for these restrictions? The most prominent ground is the sovereignty and integrity of India. You cannot use your freedom of speech to incite secession. Other major grounds include the security of the state, maintaining friendly relations with foreign states, and preserving public order. Furthermore, restrictions can be placed in the interest of decency or morality, or in relation to contempt of court and defamation. Your rights end where the rights of others and the safety of the nation begin. Next is Article 20, which provides vital protections to individuals facing criminal charges. It contains three distinct safeguards. The first is protection against ex post facto laws. This means the state cannot enact a criminal law today and use it to punish you for something you did yesterday when it was perfectly legal. You can only be punished for violating a law in force at the time of the act. The second safeguard is protection against double jeopardy. This principle dictates that no person shall be prosecuted and punished for the same offense more than once. If a court acquits or convicts you, the state cannot keep trying you for the exact same crime. The third safeguard is protection against self-incrimination. The police cannot force you to be a witness against yourself. You have the right to remain silent. These three pillars ensure that the immense power of the state's criminal justice system is not abused. We now arrive at what the Supreme Court has called the heart of the fundamental rights, Article 21. It states that no person shall be deprived of his life or personal liberty except according to procedure established by law. Notice it says person, not just citizen. This applies to everyone on Indian soil. Over the decades, the Supreme Court has dramatically expanded the scope of Article 21. It is no longer just about surviving or staying out of jail. Through landmark judgments, the court has ruled that the right to life means a life of human dignity. It now encompasses the right to a clean environment, the right to privacy, the right to health, and the right to free legal aid. Article 21 is a living, breathing provision that constantly evolves to protect the individual against arbitrary state action, making it the most heavily litigated and profoundly important article in the Constitution. The final article in the right to freedom is Article 22, which deals with protection against arrest and detention. This article provides procedural safeguards to anyone taken into custody. To understand it, you must distinguish between two types of detention. Punitive detention is what happens after a trial. You commit a crime, you are found guilty, and you are punished. Preventive detention, however, is detaining a person without a trial, merely on the suspicion that they might commit a crime in the future. It is a controversial power. For ordinary punitive arrests, Article 22 guarantees specific rights. You have the right to be informed of the grounds of your arrest immediately, and the right to consult a legal practitioner of your choice. Most importantly, you must be produced before the nearest magistrate within 24 hours of your arrest. This prevents the police from holding someone indefinitely in secret custody, ensuring judicial oversight begins almost immediately. Moving from the right to equality, we arrive at the right to freedom, specifically Article 19. This article originally contained 7 rights, but the right to property was removed. Today, it guarantees 6 fundamental freedoms to all citizens. First is the freedom of speech and expression, the bedrock of any democracy. Second is the right to assemble peacefully and without arms. Third, citizens can form associations, unions, or cooperative societies. Fourth, you have the right to move freely throughout the territory of India. Fifth, you can reside and settle in any part of the country. And finally, the sixth freedom allows you to practice any profession or carry on any occupation, trade, or business. Remember, these are not absolute. The state can impose reasonable restrictions on grounds like sovereignty, security, and public order. You must memorize these 6 freedoms, as UPSC frequently tests the exact grounds for these restrictions in the preliminary examination. Let's move to the most fiercely protected rights in our Constitution. Article 20 provides protection in respect of conviction for offences. It shields you against retrospective criminal laws, double jeopardy, and self incrimination. Then we have Article 21, which declares that no person shall be deprived of his life or personal liberty except according to procedure established by law. This is the widest right. The Supreme Court has expanded it to include the right to privacy, clean environment, and speedy trial. In 2002, the 86th Amendment added Article 21A. So, what exactly did this amendment guarantee? It made free and compulsory education a fundamental right for children between 6 and 14 years. It is crucial to note that Articles 20 and 21 are the only fundamental rights that cannot be suspended even during a national emergency. This was a critical safeguard added by the 44th Amendment Act to prevent the abuse of power. Next is the right against exploitation, covered under Articles 23 and 24. This is a vital area for UPSC mains when discussing social justice. Let's compare them. Article 23 prohibits traffic in human beings, bigar, and other similar forms of forced labor. This right is available to both citizens and non-citizens. It protects individuals not just against the state, but also against private persons. However, there is a key exception. The state can impose compulsory service for public purposes, like military conscription or social service, without paying you. Now, Article 24 specifically targets child labor. It prohibits the employment of children below the age of 14 years in any factory, mine, or other hazardous activities. But notice the exception here. It does not prohibit their employment in harmless or innocent work, such as helping in a family business after school hours. Understanding this subtle distinction is exactly what the UPSC examiners expect from you. India is a secular state, and this is operationalized through the right to freedom of religion, spanning Articles 25 to 28. Let us break down how the Constitution guarantees this. Article 25 guarantees the freedom of conscience and the right to freely profess, practice, and propagate religion. This is an individual right. Moving to the community level, Article 26 gives every religious denomination the right to manage its own affairs in matters of religion and own property. To ensure the state remains neutral, Article 27 dictates that no person shall be compelled to pay any taxes specifically for the promotion or maintenance of any particular religion. The state cannot use public money to favor one faith. Finally, Article 28 prohibits religious instruction in any educational institution wholly maintained out of state funds. Together, these four articles form the bedrock of Indian secularism, balancing individual freedom with state neutrality. Beyond religion, the Constitution protects minorities through cultural and educational rights. Article 29 protects the interests of minorities by granting any section of citizens residing in India with a distinct language, script, or culture the right to conserve it. Importantly, the Supreme Court has ruled that the scope of Article 29 is not restricted to minorities alone. It includes the majority as well, if they have a distinct culture. Article 30, on the other hand, is strictly for minorities. It grants all linguistic and religious minorities the right to establish and administer educational institutions of their choice. This means the state cannot discriminate against any educational institution in granting aid simply because it is under the management of a minority. Why is this distinction between Article 29 and 30 important? Because Article 30 applies only to religious and linguistic minorities, while Article 29 applies to any section of citizens. Let's test your understanding of the fundamental rights we have covered so far. This is a classic UPSC prelim style question that trips up many candidates. Which of the following fundamental rights cannot be suspended even during a national emergency? Option A. Article 19, the right to freedom of speech and expression. Option B. Articles 20 and 21, protection in conviction and the right to life. Option C. Articles 23 and 24, the right against exploitation. Option D. Article 25, the freedom of religion. Take a moment to recall the critical safeguard introduced by the 44th Amendment Act. The correct answer is B. Articles 20 and 21 remain enforceable even during a national emergency. Remember, Article 19 can be suspended, but only when the emergency is declared on the grounds of war or external aggression, never for armed rebellion. A declaration of fundamental rights is completely meaningless without an effective machinery for their enforcement. This brings us to Article 32, the right to constitutional remedies. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar famously called Article 32 the very soul of the Constitution and the very heart of it. Without it, the other rights would be mere empty promises. Article 32 grants you the right to move the Supreme Court directly by appropriate proceedings for the enforcement of your fundamental rights. The Supreme Court is thus constituted as the ultimate defender and guarantor of these rights. It is important to note that the right to move the Supreme Court under Article 32 is itself a fundamental right. While Parliament can legally empower any other lower court to issue these directions, orders, and writs, so far, no such provision has been made. This makes the Supreme Court the primary guardian of citizen liberties. Under Article 32, the Supreme Court issues 5 types of writs. Let us examine each one. First is habeas corpus, meaning to have the body of. It is an order to produce a detained person before the court to check if the detention is legal. Second is mandamus, which means we command. It is issued to a public official asking them to perform their official duties that they have failed to perform. Third is prohibition, meaning to forbid. A higher court issues this to a lower court to prevent it from exceeding its jurisdiction. Fourth is certiorari, meaning to be certified. It is issued by a higher court to quash the order of a lower court or tribunal. Finally, quo warranto means by what authority. It prevents illegal usurpation of a public office by a person. You must know the exact purpose of each writ for the exam. We now transition from Part 3 to Part IV of the Constitution, which contains the Directive Principles of State Policy, or DPSPs, covered under Articles 36 to 51. These principles are the ideals that the state should keep in mind while formulating policies and enacting laws. The framers of our Constitution borrowed this innovative concept from the Irish Constitution of 1937, which had copied it from the Spanish Constitution. Unlike fundamental rights, the directive principles are non-justiciable in nature. What does non-justiciable mean? It means they are not legally enforceable by the courts for their violation. You cannot sue the government for failing to implement them. However, Article 37 itself declares that these principles are nevertheless fundamental in the governance of the country. It is the moral obligation of the state to apply these principles in making laws to establish a welfare state. The Constitution does not formally classify the directive principles. However, based on their content and direction, we can categorize them into 3 broad ideological groups. The first category is socialistic principles. These reflect the ideology of socialism and aim to provide social and economic justice. They set the path towards a welfare state, directing the government to minimize inequalities in income and provide adequate means of livelihood. The second category consists of Gandhian principles. These are based on the Gandhian ideology and represent the program of reconstruction enunciated by Mahatma Gandhi during the national movement. They focus on village governance and rural upliftment. The third category is liberal intellectual principles. These represent the ideology of liberalism, directing the state to secure a uniform civil code, provide early childhood care, and protect the environment. UPSI often asks you to identify which principle belongs to which specific ideological category. Let us look closely at the Gandhian principles, as they are a favorite topic for the examiners. These directives specifically aim to realize Gandhi's vision for India. Article 40 directs the state to organize village panchayats and endow them with necessary powers to function as units of self-government. This was later realized through the 73rd Amendment. Article 43 asks the state to promote cottage industries on an individual or cooperative basis in rural areas, fostering local economic independence. Article 46 requires the state to promote the educational and economic interests of SCZs and other weaker sections, protecting them from social injustice. Finally, Article 47 directs the state to bring about the prohibition of the consumption of intoxicating drinks and drugs, which are injurious to health. Understanding these specific articles helps you write stronger essays on rural development and governance. To solidify your understanding, let us compare fundamental rights and directive principles directly. First, look at their nature. Fundamental rights are negative injunctions. They prohibit the state from doing certain things. Directive principles are positive instructions requiring the state to do certain things. Second, regarding enforceability. Fundamental rights are justiciable, meaning courts can enforce them. Directive principles are non-justiciable. Courts cannot force the government to implement them. Third, consider their core objective. Fundamental rights aim to establish political democracy in the country. In contrast, directive principles aim to establish social and economic democracy. Finally, look at their legal status. Fundamental rights have legal sanctions behind them, while directive principles have moral and political sanctions. The real sanction behind DPSPs is public opinion and the voters at the ballot box. This distinction forms the core of many landmark Supreme Court judgments. Moving forward from fundamental rights, we now enter another crucial pillar of the Constitution. Part 4, spanning Articles 36 to 51, deals with the directive principles of state policy. The framers borrowed this innovative concept directly from the Irish Constitution, which had itself adapted it from Spain. Unlike fundamental rights, these directives are non-justiciable in nature. This means you cannot go to a court to legally force the government to implement them. However, they are absolutely fundamental in the governance of the country. Their primary aim is to establish a robust social and economic democracy, ensuring that political freedom is backed by economic justice. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar famously described these principles as the novel features of the Indian Constitution. For your UPSC exam, remember that while fundamental rights act as negative limitations on the state, directive principles act as positive instructions for the state to follow when framing laws and policies. The Constitution itself does not formally classify the directive principles. However, based on their content and direction, scholars generally categorize them into three broad ideological groups. Let us look at this classification, which is highly useful for structuring your mains answers. The first category consists of the socialistic principles. These directives reflect the ideology of socialism. They lay down the framework for a democratic socialist state, aiming to provide social and economic justice and set the path towards a welfare state. The second category comprises the Gandhian principles. These are based on Gandhian ideology and represent the program of reconstruction enunciated by Mahatma Gandhi during the national movement. They focus heavily on rural upliftment and decentralization. The third category is the liberal intellectual principles. These directives represent the ideology of liberalism, focusing on progressive, modern, and rational governance concepts. Understanding this tripartite division helps you analyze how the framers blended different political philosophies into one cohesive document. Let us examine some frequently tested articles from the socialistic and Gandhian categories. Under the socialistic umbrella, Article 39 is paramount. It directs the state to secure adequate means of livelihood and ensure the equitable distribution of material resources to prevent the concentration of wealth. Article 41 further strengthens this by directing the state to secure the right to work, to education, and to public assistance in cases of unemployment or old age. Shifting to Gandhian principles, Article 40 is a cornerstone. It mandates the organization of village panchayats, empowering them to function as units of self-government. Similarly, Article 43 promotes cottage industries on a cooperative basis in rural areas, reflecting Gandhi's vision for self-reliant villages. Finally, Article 47 directs the state to prohibit the consumption of intoxicating drinks and drugs. So, if a state bans alcohol, which principle are they applying? They are applying this exact Gandhian directive under Article 47. Now, let us look at the liberal intellectual principles, which focus on modernization and progressive governance. The most debated among these is Article 44, which directs the state to secure a uniform civil code for all citizens throughout the territory of India. This remains a highly relevant topic for your exams. Article 45 originally mandated free and compulsory education. After the 86th Amendment, it now directs the state to provide early childhood care and education for all children until they complete the age of 6 years. Article 48 requires the state to organize agriculture and animal husbandry on modern and scientific lines, moving away from primitive methods. Article 50 is crucial for the rule of law. It directs the state to separate the judiciary from the executive in public services, ensuring judicial independence. Finally, Article 51 directs the state to promote international peace and security and maintain just and honorable relations between nations. Let us test your understanding of the fundamental nature of these directives. This is a classic prelims-style conceptual question. Which of the following statements about directive principles is correct? Option A. They are legally enforceable in courts. Option B. They override fundamental rights automatically. Option C. They are fundamental in the governance of the country. Option D. They apply only to the union government. Take a few seconds to evaluate each statement based on what we just covered. The correct answer is option C. Article 37 explicitly states that while these principles are not enforceable by any court, they are nevertheless fundamental in the governance of the country. It is the duty of the state to apply these principles in making laws. Option A is incorrect because they are non-justiciable. Option B is incorrect because they do not automatically override rights. And option D is wrong because they apply to all tiers of the state. To consolidate your understanding, let us directly compare fundamental rights and directive principles. This distinction is a frequent topic in the mains examination. First, look at their nature. Fundamental rights are generally negative or prohibitive. They tell the state what it cannot do. Directive principles are positive. They instruct the state on what it should do. Second, consider justiciability. Fundamental rights are legally enforceable. If violated, you can move the Supreme Court. Directive principles are non-justiciable. You cannot sue the government for failing to implement them. Third, they aim at different types of democracy. Fundamental rights establish political democracy by protecting individual liberties. Directive principles aim to establish social and economic democracy by addressing inequality. Finally, regarding legal supremacy. In a direct conflict, fundamental rights generally enjoy legal supremacy over directive principles. However, Parliament has repeatedly tried to alter this balance through constitutional amendments, leading to historic legal battles that shaped our constitution. The relationship between fundamental rights and directive principles has been a historic battleground between Parliament and the Supreme Court. It began with the Champakam Dorarajan case in 1951, where the court ruled that in any conflict, fundamental rights would prevail and directives must run as subsidiary. The tension escalated with the Golaknath case in 1967. The court ruled that fundamental rights are sacrosanct and Parliament cannot amend them, even to implement directives. Parliament reacted aggressively by passing the 24th and 25th Amendments, asserting its absolute power to amend any part of the Constitution. They introduced Article 31C, stating that laws made to implement certain socialistic directives could not be voided for violating specific fundamental rights. What happens when the legislature tries to completely override the judiciary? It forces a constitutional crisis demanding a definitive resolution. This intense power struggle directly set the stage for the most important judicial pronouncement in Indian history. That definitive resolution came in 1973 with the landmark Kesavananda Bharati case. A 13-judge bench of the Supreme Court sat down to resolve the conflict between Parliament's amending power and the sanctity of fundamental rights. The court delivered a brilliant compromise. They conceded that Parliament has the power to amend any part of the Constitution, including fundamental rights, to implement directive principles. However, they drew a hard line by introducing the doctrine of the basic structure. The court ruled that while Parliament can amend the Constitution, it cannot alter or destroy its basic structure. This meant that Parliament's power to amend is not absolute, it is subject to judicial review. This judgment saved Indian democracy from potential authoritarianism. It established that the Constitution is supreme, not the Parliament. The Kesavananda Bharati verdict remains the bedrock of Indian constitutional law, ensuring that core values envisioned by the framers can never be erased by a temporary political majority. The balance between these two parts of the Constitution was finally settled in the Minerva Mills case of 1980. Let us write down the core takeaways from this verdict. First, the Supreme Court struck down the absolute primacy that the 42nd Amendment had tried to give to all directive principles over fundamental rights. Second, the court laid down a beautiful philosophical principle. It declared that the Indian Constitution is founded on the bedrock of balance between Part 3 and Part 4. To explain this, the judges used a powerful analogy. They said that fundamental rights and directive principles are like two wheels of a chariot. One is not superior to the other. Giving absolute primacy to one disturbs the harmony of the Constitution. The final result of this legal evolution is clear. Fundamental rights enjoy legal supremacy, but Parliament can amend them to implement directives, provided the amendment does not destroy the basic structure. Having discussed rights and directives, we must now look at the responsibilities of the citizens. Fundamental duties were not present in the original Constitution. They were added during the internal emergency by the 42nd Constitutional Amendment Act in 1976. This addition was made upon the recommendation of the Swaran Singh Committee, which argued that citizens must realize that in addition to enjoying rights, they also have certain obligations. The framers of this amendment were heavily inspired by the Constitution of the erstwhile USSR, which placed a strong emphasis on citizen duties. These duties are contained in a single new part, Part 4A, and a single article, Article 51A. They are non-justiciable, meaning you cannot be penalized by a court simply for not following them unless Parliament passes a specific law. Originally, there were 10 fundamental duties. An 11th duty, regarding the education of children, was added later in 2002. Let us check your memory on that last point. as amendments are heavily tested in the UPSC prelims. Which constitutional amendment added the 11th fundamental duty regarding education? Option A. The 42nd Amendment of 1976. Option B. The 44th Amendment of 1978. Option C. The 86th Amendment of 2002. Option D. The 97th Amendment of 2011. Take a moment to recall the timeline of educational rights and duties. The correct answer is option C, the 86th Amendment Act of 2002. This is a critical amendment because it did three things simultaneously. It made education a fundamental right under Article 21A. It changed the subject matter of Article 45 in the Directive Principles. And it added the 11th fundamental duty requiring parents or guardians to provide opportunities for education to their children between the ages of 6 and 14 years. Before we move on to the amendment procedures in the next section, let us do a rapid active recall exercise to lock in the key facts from this module. I will show you a prompt, and you supply the missing information. First prompt. Directive principles are borrowed from the Constitution of where? Think about the international inspirations. The answer is Ireland. The Irish Constitution itself borrowed it from Spain. Next prompt. The doctrine of basic structure was established in the which landmark case? This is the most important case in Indian constitutional history. The answer is the Kesavananda Bharati case of 1973. Final prompt. Fundamental duties are enshrined in Article. Which specific article number? Remember, it is a single article in a newly added part. The answer is Article 51A, located in Part 4A. If you recalled all three correctly, your foundational knowledge of Parts 3, 4, and 4A is solid. Moving directly into the historical conflict between these two pillars, we see an inherent tension between individual rights and state goals. On one hand, you have fundamental rights, which are individualistic and justiciable. On the other, directive principles mandate the state to achieve social and economic welfare. Article 13 explicitly protects fundamental rights by declaring any law inconsistent with them as void. However, Article 37 makes directive principles non-justiciable, meaning you cannot enforce them in a court, yet they are fundamental in the governance of the country. This created a massive constitutional dilemma. Parliament frequently sought to amend fundamental rights to implement directive principles, particularly regarding land reforms and property rights. This friction led to decades of intense judicial and legislative battles, shaping the very nature of Indian democracy. As an aspirant, understanding this tug-of-war is absolutely critical because it forms the foundation of almost every major constitutional amendment and Supreme Court judgment that followed. Let us map out the evolution of this primacy battle through a clear timeline. It all started with the Champakam Dorairajan case in 1951, where the Supreme Court ruled that fundamental rights would prevail over directive principles in case of any conflict. This established early judicial dominance. Then came the explosive Golaknath case in 1967. Here, the Supreme Court took a radical stance, declaring that Parliament had absolutely no power to amend or abridge fundamental rights, effectively making them sacrosanct. Parliament retaliated with the 24th Amendment in 1971, which explicitly restored and expanded its power to amend any part of the Constitution, including fundamental rights, to implement state policies. This escalating war between the legislature and the judiciary finally culminated in the monumental Kesavananda Bharati case of 1973. This case had to resolve whether Parliament's amending power was truly unlimited, or if the Constitution had a core identity that could not be touched. The Kesavananda Bharati case of 1973 is arguably the most important judicial decision in Indian history. It was heard by the largest bench in Supreme Court history, comprising 13 judges, indicating the sheer gravity of the constitutional crisis. The petitioners challenged the validity of the 24th, 25th, and 29th Amendments, questioning the absolute power of Parliament to rewrite the Constitution. In a razor-thin majority of 7 to 6, the court upheld Parliament's broad power to amend any part of the Constitution, including fundamental rights. However, they introduced the revolutionary basic structure doctrine as a massive caveat. This doctrine essentially prevented the rewriting of the Constitution's core identity. The court said Parliament can amend, but it cannot destroy or fundamentally alter the essential features that make the Constitution what it is. This brilliant judicial innovation saved Indian democracy from potential authoritarianism while allowing for necessary socio-economic reforms. Let us clearly define what this doctrine actually means for your exam. The core definition is that Parliament cannot alter the essential features of the Constitution. Think of the Constitution as a grand building. You can renovate the rooms, but you cannot destroy the foundation. The immediate implication of this is that Article 368, which grants the amending power, is not absolute. Parliament is a creature of the Constitution, and therefore, it cannot use its amending power to destroy its creator. So, who decides what belongs to this foundation? The judiciary does. Through the power of judicial review, the Supreme Court decides what constitutes the basic structure on a case-by-case basis. There is no exhaustive list provided in the Constitution itself. The court evaluates each amendment to see if it damages the democratic, secular, or federal fabric of the nation. This makes the Supreme Court the ultimate guardian of the Constitution's soul. To truly grasp the magnitude of the basic structure doctrine, imagine the Constitution not just as a book of laws, but as a massive, unshakable architectural bedrock. Above ground, the building can change. Governments will come and go, policies will shift, and new laws will be drafted to meet the needs of a modernizing society. But beneath the surface, there are massive pillars holding the entire structure up. These pillars are concepts like democracy, secularism, equality, and judicial independence. If a government tries to pass an amendment that chips away at one of these foundational pillars, the entire democratic structure is put at risk of collapse. The Supreme Court, through the Kesavananda Bharati judgment, essentially drew a permanent line in the sand around these pillars. They declared that while the elected representatives have the mandate to govern and amend, they do not have the mandate to destroy the very foundation upon which the republic stands. Since the Constitution does not list these foundational pillars, let us look at the key elements identified by the courts over time. First is the supremacy of the Constitution. Established firmly in Kesavananda Bharati, it means no entity, not even Parliament, is above the constitutional text. Next is secularism. The S.R. Bommai case heavily reinforced that the state having no official religion is a basic feature, and state governments can be dismissed if they act against it. Then we have judicial review. The Minerva Mills case made it clear that the power of courts to check state action cannot be taken away, as it is essential for the rule of law. Finally, the rule of law itself, heavily emphasized in the Indira Gandhi versus Raj Narayan case, ensures that law is supreme over individuals, preventing arbitrary state action. You must memorize these pairings of elements and their corresponding landmark cases for your preliminary exams. Following Kesavananda, the next major milestone is the Minerva Mills case of 1980. During the emergency, Parliament passed the 42nd Amendment, which attempted to place constitutional amendments beyond judicial review. The Supreme Court struck down these specific sections. In doing so, the court powerfully reaffirmed the supremacy of the basic structure doctrine, proving it was not just a one-time ruling but a permanent shield. More importantly, for our earlier discussion, this case established a permanent harmony between fundamental rights and directive principles. Chief Justice Chandrachud famously described them as two wheels of a chariot. You cannot prioritize one so much that the other breaks. They must exist in balance for the nation to move forward. By striking down the clauses that tried to shield laws from scrutiny, the court fully restored the power of judicial review, ensuring that the balance between individual liberty and social welfare remains subject to constitutional checks. Let us pause and test your understanding of this critical constitutional evolution. Here is your question. Which landmark case established the basic structure doctrine? Option A is the Golaknath case. Option B is the Kesavananda Bharati case. Option C is the Minerva Mills case. And option D is the S.R. Bommai case. Take a few seconds to recall the timeline we just discussed. The correct answer is B, the Kesavananda Bharati case of 1973. While Golaknath made rights unamendable and Minerva Mills reaffirmed the balance, it was the 13-judge bench in Kesavananda that first articulated that Parliament cannot alter the essential foundational features of the Constitution. This is the most frequently tested concept in the entire polity syllabus, so ensure this fact is permanently locked in your memory before you walk into the examination hall. The doctrine did not stop evolving in 1980. It continued to expand through subsequent judgments. The S.R. Bommai case in 1994 is a prime example, where the court reinforced federalism and secularism as basic features, strictly limiting the misuse of President's rule under Article 356. Later, the I.R. Coelho case in 2007 addressed a major loophole. The Ninth Schedule, which was originally designed to protect laws from judicial review. The court ruled that any laws placed in the Ninth Schedule after 24 April 1973, the date of the Kesavananda verdict, are still open to judicial review if they violate the basic structure. This firmly established that the Supreme Court remains the ultimate interpreter of the Constitution, closing the door on legislative bypasses. Ultimately, this evolving jurisprudence ensures the Constitution remains a living, stable document, capable of adapting to modern challenges while fiercely protecting the democratic soul of the Indian Republic. Let us do a rapid active recall exercise to lock in these landmark judgments. I will give you a prompt, and you supply the case name. First, the case that made fundamental rights completely unamendable by Parliament in 1967. Think about the timeline. That was the Golaknath case, which triggered the massive legislative backlash. Next, the doctrine protecting the Constitution's core identity from being destroyed by Article 368 amendments. That is the basic structure doctrine, born from Kesavananda Bharati. Finally, the 1980 case that established a permanent harmony between fundamental rights and directive principles, calling them two wheels of a chariot. That was the Minerva Mills case. Mastering these specific associations is exactly how you eliminate incorrect options in the prelims and write authoritative, high-scoring essays in the mains. Keep these pairings at the forefront of your revision strategy. As we synthesize this module for your UPSC preparation, keep these strategic priorities in mind. First, you must understand the chronological evolution of these cases. The story from Champakam to Coelho is a single continuous narrative of power balancing. Second, always connect specific constitutional doctrines directly to their origin judgments, just as we did with secularism and Bommai. Third, deeply analyze how the judiciary balances state power against individual liberty. This is the core theme of Indian polity. Fourth, actively use these cases to substantiate your mains answers. An answer on federalism is incomplete without mentioning Bomme, just as an answer on amendments needs Kesavananda. Mastering this dynamic is crucial for maximizing your polity score, as it demonstrates a mature, analytical understanding of our democratic framework and the separation of powers. Visit Examiverse AI Studio to automate your training modules. Thank you for joining us today. Keep studying hard, and you will surely master this subject. We will see you in the next lesson.